Clear prop.
Star 73, Cherokee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I am fantastic, as always. This week, man, this is something I'm passionate about. I sit in my office about 100 feet from my flight line that has 14 single-engine trainers on it out there. And from my office, I can hear crank, 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 crank. And it's always frustrating for me to sit here thinking about the starter that I bought last week, that I'm going to have to buy another one in a couple weeks because the cranking continues. This week is all about starting your engines. Wally, you've flown a lot of GA stuff. You ever had trouble starting an engine?
I've had lots of trouble starting engines.
So why is it so hard to start a dang 4-cylinder engine?
Well, I think
I get in my Ford F-150
yeah,
and I push a button and it comes to life every time.
I know, and I think that's the problem. I think the cars that we have are so good. They are so good. They start almost every time, unless you have a dead battery. For the most part, they start, and they have computers in there. And basically, the way the cars start is you're sending a message to the computer that says, start the engine. And the computer measures temperature, measures all kinds of elements that we never consider, and it does what it needs to do, and it starts the car. Problem is, well, the good thing is that the cars that most of us drive is recent technology. The airplanes that we fly is probably, and I'm probably not, this isn't probably too much of a stretch, that it's 1940s, 1950s technology.
Oh, I bet it's even older than that in a lot of cases, really and truly.
Yeah.
I think the other piece of it, so, you know, I used to work on lawnmower engines when I was a kid, right? I kind of knew what the spark plug was doing, how it got its spark.
Yeah.
I think I knew what was happening with the single piston that was in that engine. I knew what a capacitor was and how that electricity was stored and used. I knew what a choke was. I knew how to get air and fuel into that cylinder and hope and pray that spark occurred. And my son, albeit now a grown man, turned 18 last week, he's not got a clue on any of those things. Like, he gets in a truck, and I think he does have a key, but I guarantee you it started every time he's turned the key without fail.
Right.
He complains about putting fuel in it. I mean, he's never checked the oil. He has none of this history.
Yeah.
And these engines, they're built more like 4 lawnmower engines. I mean, that's really what they are.
Yeah.
They work together to create what we call 4 strokes. We'll talk about that. We talked about that in many other shows. We won't talk about that today. But I think what the problem is that we don't really understand that we are the computer. In a brand new King Ranch pickup truck like mine, it's called a FADEC system. It's a fully automated computer system that's managing everything. Like you said, it probably knows the barometric pressure outside and knows exactly how to mix the air and fuel together to get the perfect spark on the perfect turn.
Yeah.
But these aircraft engines don't know that.
Yeah.
We don't know the temperature of the engine before we start it. We don't know, is it above 120 degrees Fahrenheit or not? Right. That would be hot versus cold.
Yeah.
These engines need a lot of finesse to get going, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Well, a perfect example of our cars is I went out and got in my car yesterday and jumped in and started it up, and it gave me a low tire pressure warning. The rear left tire, the tire that I just walked by, of the 4 tires on the car that I really walked by, I walked by the rear left tire and got in the car, didn't notice anything wrong. And instead of 37 psi, that tire had 18 pounds of air pressure, which told me that I definitely had a problem. And I took it in. Sure enough, there's a nail in the tire, and I got it fixed. Now, had it not been for that automated system, I think eventually I would have realized that there was a problem. But the automation that we have in our cars is really good, but we have to know that the airplanes don't have that. So
it's a great example. You probably don't pre-flight your tires every time you go get in your Jeep to drive off somewhere, right?
No, because you
don't need to. You just got a computer that's going to tell you.
Right. But guess what? The airplanes don't have it.
We look at those tires ad nauseum and check the pressures with a hand gauge, and we know what's going on in those tires before we take off. Because the outcome would be very different than if you had to pull over and get a wrecker to come fix your tire, right?
Yeah.
I think as I reflect back to my training a lot around here and how I was trained and how we can make training better for all the students that come here, I think we are babied when we're learning how to fly, right? CFIs are, I don't want to say frustrated, but they have a mission in mind. They have a goal in mind. They've told the same story today, how airspace works or how to start an engine over and over again. And they want to make sure you get some flight time and that they get some flight time. So they're reaching over and they're throwing some switches and they're doing stuff. And they say, see how I did that? Just do that next time. I'm being facetious a little bit, but they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, right? They might have the mixture halfway in. They might have primed it or didn't prime it. They might not explain why they primed it or didn't prime it. They probably know by nature that the plane just came back because they talked up front with the other CFI who just landed. And they know it's a hot engine. And the time goes by where you're being told how to start. You're not following a procedure. You're not analyzing, is it a hot engine? Is it a cold engine? And lo and behold, you're a solo pilot now. And one of the best stories I have about being a solo pilot, or maybe even a private pilot working on my instrument, I was going on a trip by myself. I'm trying to start the engine. I'm having trouble starting a fuel-injected engine. Might have been one of the first times I ever started a fuel-injected engine by myself. And it finally caught, boom, goes really loud and hard, lots of fuel in those cylinders. And my flight instructor was walking across the hangar in front of me and just starts shaking his head. Doesn't even look, doesn't know who's in the plane. I've done the same head shake 1,000 times since I bought the flight school. And I can tell he's disappointed in me not probably following the right procedure or something. And as the engine comes to life and warms up, I sent him a text message that said, don't forget, asshole, you told me how to start the thing to begin with, right? It wasn't like I didn't have him teaching me, right? So I think it does come from probably bad lessons taught and tricks. And we'll talk through some of those today and hopefully help everybody be better at starting an engine.
Yeah.
So there are big differences. We talked about car engines and aircraft engines. And the biggest one really is the flow by which the starting process occurs. Let's just assume cars are automatic. Everything that happens is automatic. In a Cessna, well, we'll call it more a Lycoming 4-cylinder engine. In a Warrior or a Cessna, it's got a carburetor or it's got a fuel injection system. Let's assume those really change the way we prime it, or if we need to prime it. The carburetor a little unnaturally sits on the bottom of an aircraft engine so that they can be seen, but that's really not the most ideal spot for a carburetor to sit. Where does a carburetor sit in a vehicle? Wally, do you know?
Probably above everything.
Yeah, right up on top, right?
Gravity works.
Gravity wants to work and help that fuel get down into the intake system.
Right.
So if you think about the way, a little engine lesson again, intake is a system by which on the engine takes the fuel and air mixture and sends it to the right cylinder with a valve system at the exact right time so that the fuel and air mixture goes into the cylinder, compresses, and ignites all at the exact same time, at the perfect time. And there's a lot that has to go involved at the right time for that to work. Timing of the engine, a lot of other things. So the mechanic's going to do most of that work. But you have to realize that you're working with a bunch of knobs and switches to get the fuel and air mixture right into that engine, right? That's probably the biggest thing that you're working on. So a FADEC system in a car is doing all that. It's all completely automatic. And so we need three things to start an airplane engine. We need some fuel, we need some air, and we need some spark.
Yeah.
And those three things have to be timed up just right. And if they are timed up, we're going to probably start that engine. We've probably all been lucky starting an engine too. And the reason is if there's fuel in there, even if the spark's timed wrong, it's probably going to light the fuel on fire, right? And while we learn about detonation and backfires and all this, those are pretty rare in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
If we can get fuel delivered to those cylinders, we're probably going to start that engine. What lever / knob / thing in the cockpit do we move that helps us get fuel? There's more than one, but let's just talk about all of them because we are the FADEC system. We have to know how to make them all work. What are some of the knobs and levers we might need to turn or push in the cockpit to make fuel get to those cylinders?
Well, obviously the mixture.
The mixture. That's the big one for sure. What other knob or lever would we push to put fuel into the cylinders?
Well, depending on the type of engine, but we might have a primer, and it may be a manual primer. Could be the fuel pump, or it could be the throttle itself.
So if we open up the mixture, we push it all the way in, we push the throttle in some. We're in essence saying we've opened a flap in the carburetor, assuming it's carbureted, and we're allowing a little bit of air and fuel to get into that intake system. We prime it. We prime it. What else is there? And I think, again, a FADEC system. Have you ever turned the fuel on your car?
No.
We never even think about turning fuel on, but we have to turn the fuel on. We have to make sure the fuel is on in an aircraft, right? And so Cessna, there's a fuel switch on the floor that's off, left, both, and right.
Right.
We got to make sure that's, I guess it's a lever, that lever is in the right position, right? Because if it's in the off position, we can crank all day. We are not going to get fuel to those cylinders.
Right.
There's also an on-off push button in a Cessna, and we need to make sure that's full in so that we are not starving or cutting off the fuel completely from the engine. So you think that's pretty basic engine, but we got a primer, we got an on-off switch, we got a lever that's allowing us to select whether it comes from the left tank, the right tank, both tanks, or no tanks. We got a mixture control, a throttle control, maybe a fuel pump instead of a primer. That's a lot going on. That's a lot going on for someone who might be afraid of flying to begin with and they'll learn how to fly.
Yeah.
That's a lot to teach, right?
Very
and
much.
So that's why CFI is getting this mode of reaching over and flipping things on and off and priming or not priming. So once we maybe learn how all that works and we get it set to the right way, there's many different configurations which could actually equal the right way. And those are all in the POH. So I think of a cold start, a hot start, and a flooded start. Those are the three things that I would think about when starting. Is this engine cold, hot, or flooded? And that's going to help me start it. So a lot of times when I hear the cranking going on, what do you think it is out there?
Yeah, they're using the wrong procedure. They probably flooded it. And a lot of times when I ask students, if it's a student, I ask them, what's the flooded procedure? And normally they don't know. I think it's the last time it was flooded, I was with my flight instructor and they just started the airplane for me. That's normally an answer that I get. Yeah.
But the flooded procedure is pretty simple, and we're going to talk through that. But so at the beginning of the day, all these engines are going to be cold and they're going to require cold start. I think the bigger piece that I think about when I think about a cold start is you're probably going to prime it more than you would if it was hot or just finished another flight previous to this flight. So cold start, I'm going to prime it. I think the Cessna says 4 to 6 pumps. Warrior probably says 4 to 6 pumps. That's really not a whole lot of fuel. I mean, that's a straw about 4 inches, and it's pulling a little bit of fuel out of the fuel system, pumping it into the intake or cylinders, depending on how the engine's set up. And we're putting some gas in there, a little bit of fuel. But the thing is, I can't leave that. I can't go to the bathroom. I can't prime it and then go to the bathroom. I guess I could, but what's going to happen to that fuel? I don't have to be a chemist to understand this. If I were to pour 4 ounces or an ounce of fuel on the ground, what's going to happen?
It's going to evaporate.
It's going to evaporate, and it's not going to take very long. Now, if I poured it into a cup, it might stay there a little bit longer, but we're spraying that into the cylinders of an engine that does really 2 things. It's going to get into the cylinders and it's going to run down. One thing as an engine owner I think about is we're actually taking the oil coating off the side of that cylinder as well. So I don't want to prime and wait, because all I'm doing is taking all that protective lubricant off those cylinders and maybe creating a problem that I don't want metal on metal either, right? So
Right.
prime it and get through the checklist at your current pace and get that engine started would be the goal. So I've primed it, and then I have to do a few things with the checklist will tell me to probably have on a carbureted engine mixture full rich and a throttle about 1/4 of an inch in, so that I've set the diaphragm or the flapper inside the carburetor to where it's open, so now air and fuel can get into the intake system. And then I got to turn the key from left, right, both, and then all the way to start. And that's spring loaded so that I don't leave it there on accident, right? So I hit start. I'm starting that engine. If I've got fuel, I've got air, and I've got a good spark, it's probably going to start. And I would say the biggest problem out here of the crank is a flooded engine. Someone's primed, and they've, again, fuel's pretty easy to get to those cylinders. It's not normally fuel. So it's a student who doesn't realize the plane just flew. The engine's probably 150 degrees plus sitting on the ground. They put a bunch of fuel in those cylinders, and it's just not going to start. And you'll probably see fuel on the ground. And if it's carbureted, you're creating a real risk for engine fire, right? For carburetor fire. And I think we talked about it almost a year ago. What is the procedure? Most people don't know what that procedure is. And
that is a big deal.
A very big deal. So what would you do if you happen to over fuel prime an engine and you saw a fire on the start of that engine? Wally, what steps would you take?
Absent of not having the checklist procedure memorized for that airplane, I would pull the mixture to idle cutoff and keep cranking.
That's it. That would probably be the de facto answer and the right answer for most single-engine four-cylinder trainers.
Yeah.
But if you have the checklist, definitely refer to that checklist. And I would memorize. That's definitely a memory item for me on that airplane, because getting out and watching the plane burn is not a really good option. Please don't let that be what you do, because you don't know the checklist.
You're becoming a chemist at that point. You're removing, you're removing the fuel, and that's one of the three components we need for a fire. And by continuing to crank, you're hopefully sucking the flames inside, and you're smothering the fire.
Yes, and that is what you want to have happen for sure. And if that does happen, you need to have a mechanic check that engine, make sure that you haven't sucked some air filter up in there, burnt the air filter some, and pulled it into the engine. But hopefully that won't happen to y'all. And I can assure you, 99.9% of the time, if you follow the checklist in the POH, you're not going to create that problem.
Right.
What I see happen all the time is I hear a fuel pump come on, and I know that plane just came back, and I'm trying to think is that complacency? Is that some trick that someone told them is going to work? It's very rare that all of our home baked tricks for starting engines really work.
Right.
It might have worked once, but it's not a replacement for the POH.
Right.
The person that wrote the POH probably knew better than you did about how to start that engine. And so that brings us to a hot start. On a hot start, the difference really is going to be that I don't need to prime it. Like, it should catch and run a lot easier than it would if it was cold. The common error being there that we put too much fuel into that hot engine, and we try to start it with too much fuel, and then we get too flooded. So if it becomes flooded, there's no real signal other than you might hear a little bit of fluid dripping on the ground when it gets too flooded. But I would say if I primed it 4 to 6, started and it tried to catch, I probably burnt that fuel that I primed it with.
Yeah.
So I might be able to prime it again. But if it doesn't catch, priming it more at that point without a big gap in time probably won't help the situation get better. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, we've all seen the little saying, the definition of insanity is basically trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
So, you should refer to your POH and the checklist in your POH. But if that engine becomes flooded, there's only one way to get that balance of fuel, air, and spark timed right again, and that is to get some of that fuel out of that system, right? And the way you do that, and again, should be something you know how to do from your aircraft, is probably you want to do full throttle forward, full mixture cutoff. That's going to, as you crank, starve the engine of that fuel, mostly pushing air through there, getting some of that fuel out. And as that happens, it probably will catch when that mixture gets right, and you're going to instantly switch those two levers.
Right.
Going from throttle full to mixture full and throttle back. And that balance will then let the engine run normally. And it doesn't take a lot of skill to switch those two things, and it doesn't have to be instantaneous. But you don't want to run that engine too hard if it is hot and maybe that oil has kind of come down out of those cylinders some.
And that brings up a good point, is we have 3 controls that we're dealing with, and we only have 2 hands, okay? So we have the ignition switch, we have the throttle, and we have the mixture. And you have to move that mixture and that throttle fairly expeditiously. If you don't move the mixture, the engine's going to eventually quit. If you don't move the throttle, you're going to get a whole lot more power than you want. So you have to let go of that ignition switch and then get your left hand over to the throttle quadrant. Occasionally I see an applicant on a check ride, and this is something I always debrief, and I scratch my head as to where this came from, but I'll see an applicant that will use their right hand to start the engine. So that left hand is just sitting over there idle. There's nothing.
Meaning they turn the key with their right hand?
They turn the key with the right hand, yeah. And I don't know if it's because that's probably the way they start their car. I think most cars, the ignition is over on the right side, whether it's a button or an actual key. And we get in airplanes, we really ought to have our left hand on that ignition switch, and then the right hand over on the the throttle quadrant where it's close to the mixture and or the throttle.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen someone with their right hand start the engine. I have had a number of flight instructors lean way over and start, obviously, for me, etc. But 2 hands, 3 levers, 3 switches. We have to be quick to get that changed. What's the big difference that you think of from fuel injected starting to from carbureted starting?
Well, obviously in a carburetor, you're probably going to have a manual primer, and fuel-injected engines are usually bigger engines. Usually the larger engines are fuel-injected. I find that in general, for the average pilot, the fuel-injected engine is probably a little bit harder to start for people. Once you, I'll tell you a little story about my airplane. My Saratoga has a turbocharged fuel-injected engine. And when I bought the airplane, and this kind of dovetails with last week's show, we talked about checklists, and I may have come across on the show that I'm the checklist guru. I'm perfect on checklists. I do checklists every time, and I'm going to tell a story on myself, and not in a good way. But when I went and bought this airplane, it was about 5 years ago. We went up to Ohio to pick it up, and I bought it through a broker, and of course it was, we basically had the deal done, but I had not seen the airplane. And of course it was all contingent on flying the airplane and all that. So we rented a car and we went over to the small airport and got to the airplane, and the guy showed us all the little things about the airplane. Make sure you don't do this. So here's a little gotcha. If you don't do this, this will happen. Anyway, so we finally got in the airplane, and he said, okay, well, let me tell you how to start it. And so he told me, okay, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And boom, the airplane started right up. And I went, okay, all right. And I remembered that. And we went and flew it. We came back in and agreed to do the deal. Ended up buying the airplane. At that point, I had to take the rental car back to the other airport, so we took the car back. We Ubered back to the small airport. It was several hours. Fueled up the airplane, and got in the airplane, got ready to go. And so I went through the starting procedure that he had given me, and boom, the airplane started right up, took off, and flew about halfway home, and stopped to spend the night somewhere. The next day, I get out to the airplane, and I go through that procedure, and it did not work. I could not get that airplane started. And
you just bought this airplane.
I just bought the
You're
airplane.
thinking, oh, my gosh.
This is my third time to start it. And I'm trying to go through the procedure, what he told me, and I can sense that the battery is not happy. I'm just about to text him and say, hey, I can't get this thing started. What's going on? And shame on me. It never occurred to me to pull out the book. It didn't even occur to me to pull out the POH. Of course, people are standing out on the ramp looking at me, and there's the embarrassment factor. And so I finally got the airplane started, finally got it started and got it out of there and came home. And then I reverted back to the procedure that he had told me. And it worked for several weeks, and then all of a sudden I realized it didn't really work for a hot start. And then somebody finally said to me, well, have you looked in the POH? And it was a light bulb moment for me. I went, oh. And I pulled out the POH. There are 3 procedures in there: cold start, hot start, flooded start. And I have not had one single problem starting that airplane since following what was in the POH. Yeah.
And maybe everyone doesn't really know what a hot start means. What does a hot start mean to you? When would you follow the hot start versus the cold start? And I heard this recently, so I'll preemptively strike with it. Well, it's 48 degrees outside. That's pretty cold, so I'm going to call it a cold start.
Right.
Is that a cold start if the plane just got back from a 2.5 hour training flight?
No, it's not. And you know how I kind of use it? My measuring stick for a hot start versus a cold start is when I'm doing that pre-flight, when I check the oil, when I pull that dipstick out, if I'm thinking, oh man, that's hot.
Yeah.
Then it's a hot start. If it's lukewarm or I can touch it without burning myself, it's probably a cold start. And that's what I have found with the Saratoga, as I was kind of learning to get to know the airplane, how to start it. I found that a cold start was absolutely no problem. A hot start really wasn't a problem either. It was that tweener.
Yep.
That tweener start when the airplane has been sitting on the ground for an hour. Okay, if I taxi it over the fuel pumps and then start it right back up, not a problem. If the airplane's been sitting for 3 days, it was not a problem. But it was that decision of, is this a hot start or is this a cold start?
Well, that's another good question comes to my mind. Which one do you try first if it's been an hour, dipstick's warm but not really hot?
I'm going to try the hot start.
And that should be something that all the listeners take as professional wisdom.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to overprime it. You're not
Right.
going to get yourself into a flooded situation if you start there first. And if it doesn't start, then you still have the opportunity to
Yes.
go back to the cold start. And if it is the tweener, it's probably going to start fairly quickly.
Right.
Because it needed the fuel less
Right.
than it needed the heat.
Right.
So that's what I would do as well. So I think that's good tips for the listeners for sure. So let's talk about other best practices. Obviously, pull out the POH every time, right? If it's not the POH, make sure your checklist matches the POH and has all these starting mechanisms in them, starting techniques in them. My biggest pet peeve, and the one thing I'll ask all my students and all my renters to stop doing, is cranking ad nauseum for no real reason, right? That is not good for an engine.
Yeah.
And the reason it's not good for the engine is really the starter. I mean, the starters, while a ton of torque in them and for these planes, they have one little gear rubbing a really big gear. You could tear up the teeth on that big gear, the flywheel piece that's on the engine. That's expensive to fix. If you tear up the starter, it's expensive to fix. The plane's going to be down. It can turn a bunch, but it can't turn a bunch for a really long time, right? And so I would say my de facto is really 3 or 4 full turns of the prop.
Yeah.
If it's not starting, it's not going to start. I need to regroup, and I need to think through what's happened to this point. And if I just got to the plane, was the dipstick hot? I need to think through that. Common sense says do these things next, but to just keep cranking, it's not a really good thing.
Yeah, my airplane is at a different airport, and there's a maintenance shop very close to my hangar, and probably about 18 months ago, the guy that runs the maintenance shop, we were talking, and I don't know how it came up in conversation, but he paid me a compliment, and he said, I've heard you start your airplane many times. He says, I know you're a 2-turn guy. I went, what? He referred to me as a 2-turn guy. He says if that engine doesn't start after 2 turns, you discontinue the start and try something else. And I never really thought about it until he said that, and now I actually do pay attention. And usually that engine starts within 2 turns around, and it fires up.
And they all should. I mean, if you get it right, they all should start fairly quick. Of course, there's always going to be an anomaly. There's always going to be an engine that has issues. Mm-hmm. I've heard every trick on this flight line out there of pushing the primer in right as it starts to turn over, or having the throttle 50% in makes this plane start faster.
Yeah,
I gotta say, those are all tricks that are just accidentally working for that for that scenario, for that engine, for that thing. I guarantee you would probably still have better luck if you followed the POH and you used that procedure to start that engine.
Yeah,
your tricks aren't going to make the engine start every time better. Much like Wally just explained, the man's procedure worked a few times on the Saratoga.
Yeah,
but that system broke whenever the change in the engine temperature, change in the environment, something gave way. It changed to where that system didn't work quite the same. The other thing that is it's an absolute no-no, and I will stop people from doing it, is if I hear someone cranking the starter while the engine is trying to start, right?
Oh, yeah.
Thinking that they're going to help that last little bit keep going. You talk about ripping teeth off of that flywheel or that starter or ruining the engine. That is a big no-no. Even if it worked once for you, do not continue to turn that starter. That is a big no-no. You're going to do a lot of damage and probably could hurt yourself or that engine really, really bad. So please don't do that.
Yeah.
So don't be the guy or girl in the plane cranking away, trying to start an engine, not following the procedure, maybe having the mixture out, having it start for just a second and then stopping and everyone yelling, checklist, checklist, checklist. I've seen that happen on the ramp. I know people have got an engine going and it died because they had the mixture out or had the fuel switch turned off. Follow the checklists, know your procedures, read the POH for whatever plane you're flying, and be aware of what the right steps are to start that engine, whether it's cold, hot, or flooded, and you will become a better aviator for sure. Anything to wrap up with, Wally, as we close out this podcast?
No, I don't think so.
All right, everyone, as always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.